I don't know if you are amongst those who live by the calendar, but if you have been watching the calendar, especially the academic calendar, you know that much to the chagrin of those who are behind, in college at least, we are nearing the end of a quarter. And as I was looking at the calendar, the realization struck me we have 3 more meetings after this, and then will come summer. And we had promised to have midweek meditation during the academic year, so it's been a joy to see some of you who have been very regular. But perhaps we will enjoy these a little more than usual as we anticipate the ending of this season. Nestled in among the many admonitions that the Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthians, and if you have read that letter recently, you know he had quite a few admonitions for them. That was a rather troubled congregation. I have thought to myself, I'm kind of glad I wasn't asked to pastor it. I have wondered sometimes if it existed today, if we would allow it to remain in the Adventist fellowship. I don't know. They had lots of trouble. But tucked down there in the admonitions to the Corinthians is a little piece of information that if we are careful to pick it up and put it to use, it can be, I believe, of considerable benefit to our living. Paul wrote, speaking of the ancient Israelites, these words, and I'm reading from 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 11. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as admonitions for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. Here the Apostle Paul, referring to the experience of the ancient Israelites, points out to the Corinthians that the many and varied experiences of that ancient people were put down for the purpose of making a record from which the rest of us may derive some benefit. Those of us who follow along behind them in the path of believers may contemplate and draw lessons from the successes and failures of their experience. And those of us here this evening are amongst those who believe. And Paul's admonition is for us. And I can't help but noting from his invitation for us to draw lessons from their experience that it is not necessary for all of us to learn our lessons at our own expense. Not all of our lessons have to be learned at our expense. The foolish are the ones who do that. The wise, as often as they can, learn at somebody else's expense. By looking at the lives of the ancients, by seeing their mistakes and triumphs, by observing the ways of their living, we might take advice for ourselves. Perhaps you have observed that it is frequently the case that Christianity gets reduced to a set of propositions. It gets described as a collection of ideas, a list of doctrines that can easily be abstracted from life. Propositions, you know, are those nice things that can be debated and argued about, or they can be preached in complicated technical language that is the domain of clerics and theologians. And by the way, they are not the only ones who have their own technical language. I've noticed that most professions do. But they can be debated to the point the practical relevance of faith gets lost on more ordinary people and living. But when the ideas of Christianity, the principles of Christianity, are seen reflected in a life, in the living of some other human being, those ideas sometimes become more real. We more easily see how we too can live better. There is in the New Testament the record of a man whose name is quite familiar to us, but whose life remains rather obscure. We know him by the name Barnabas. We meet Barnabas first in Acts, the 4th chapter, verses 36 and 37, where it says the following: Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostle called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, sold a field he owned and brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet. In these two verses, there is quite a bit of information that gives us some introduction and understanding of this man, Barnabas. It says there that he was a Levite, which would mean that he was a Jew, the member of a priestly family, someone whom we may assume was well schooled in the religion and practice of his faith and culture. It says that he was a native of Cyprus, that island that sits out in the Mediterranean off the coasts of modern-day Israel or Lebanon and Turkey. A native of Cyprus would make him a Jew of the diaspora, a descendant of those who went out from Jerusalem for various reasons, primarily for business and because of persecution, but they went out and established themselves in the Greek world. Barnabas was a Hellenist, a Jew who spoke Greek, who had grown up with a good understanding of the Gentile world. And though he was a Jew, his experience and worldview would be quite distinct from that of Palestinian Jews like Peter, who are called by Luke Hebrews. Barnabas had grown up in two worlds, between which he could easily pass, just like Saul of Tarsus, whom we meet later on. And Barnabas, curiously, when we meet him, is not living in Cyprus, but in Jerusalem. That's a little bit curious. Why would a native of Cyprus be living in Jerusalem? Perhaps some have speculated that there was a Hellenist crowd that was returning to the homeland. Perhaps a group of Jews from the diaspora were coming back to Jerusalem for various reasons. Perhaps Barnabas was amongst them. He was living in Jerusalem from before Pentecost at least. And because the believers in Jerusalem were not at all suspicious of him, as they were later of Saul, and because Barnabas was obviously an accepted member of the Christian community in Jerusalem, we must place him as one of the company of first converts to Christianity, converted either by the early preaching of the apostles or perhaps by the preaching of Jesus himself. That realization intrigued me considerably. Barnabas, one of the earliest Christian believers amongst the group of the earliest ones. And Barnabas, we learn here, was a member of some means. It says he owned a field. He was amongst the landed, if not amongst the gentry. And how he came to own that field, we do not know, only that he did own it, and he sold it. And he brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. And I think those of us here tonight are well aware that among the early Christians, holding to possessions exclusively was not a practice that they followed. It says a few verses earlier, in fact, that all the believers were one in mind and heart. No one claimed that any of his possessions were his own, but they shared everything they had as there was need. And I have noticed that to those who have possessions, this verse looks a little scary. To those with nothing, it looks like a wonderful verse. But observe that there are some qualifications here, that the sharing of their assets, their belongings, was not done willy-nilly. It was done as people had need. And furthermore, there were no people in those days in the Christian community looking for a handout. We know also of the instruction that if you did not work, you did not eat. Nevertheless, these qualifications do not diminish the fact that Barnabas, a man of some means, sold his field, and he gave the money to the believing community. He had been so profoundly converted that nothing preceded Christ in his commitments. He had learned not to cling to things he could rightly claim as his own possessions. He had given up even his right to personal privilege. And here is pause for thought. The gospel in America today is highly individualistic. It is full of perceived privileges, personal autonomy, rights, entitlements, even license. These are held to be paramount, to say nothing of the content or the belief that God will bless you financially if you're a Christian. People today walk around full of arrogance and belligerence and pride of opinion. But where Christ dwells, those things disappear. There is no place for them. They disappear almost mysteriously, like mist on a sunny day, to be replaced by humility and a sense of belonging and trust and a sense of community. Barnabas, it says, sold a field that he owned, and he brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet, discharging to them the responsibility of caring for that gift. And then there's one more grain to glean from these verses. You and I know Barnabas as Barnabas, but you notice according to these verses that his real name was Joseph. Barnabas, it seems, was something of a nickname given to him by the apostles, a name that means son of encouragement, and it is by this name that he is best known and by which his memory is preserved in history. Names are interesting things. They reflect a lot of things: lineage, parental pride, hope, status. I remember as a young man meeting an African at my grandmother's store. His name intrigued me. It was No Last. I'd never heard that name before, and so I engaged him in dialogue, wanting to know the meaning of this, and he explained to me that he was his mother's 10th child, and he had been given that name by their parents in the hope that he would be number last, N-O, last, the last one. In our culture, we tend to pick names before birth. In some places, children are not given names until the parents have seen some identifiable trait, some trait of character that enables them to give a name that fits the child. The names are linked to some characteristic or some character trait. If you pardon the analogy, I remember the one cat we owned. We named her Bibs. And the reason for that is right in the front of her chest was a nice white bib. To me, she looked domestic. I thought perhaps the name would fit her well. After she had been with us for about a year, we seriously contemplated changing that name to Nimrod. She was not domestic at all. We found her to be a formidable hunter, and she was not above bringing us the benefits of her endeavors. See, Bibs didn't fit at all. And here is a man, not a cat or something, but a man, Joseph, the Levite from Cyprus, whose name is overtaken by a nickname, Barnabas, son of encouragement, given him by the apostles. And apparently his life was such that the apostles found the name Barnabas much more fitting to his character and to the way he lived. That's the introduction to Barnabas. We next encounter him in Acts chapter 9. And I read there from verses 26 through verse 27, "And when he," that is Saul, "came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples. But they were all afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. He told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord, and that the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. And so Saul stayed with them." Now here is an amazing episode that, if we look at it, reveals quite a bit about Barnabas. The passage, these verses begin with the words, "When Saul came to Jerusalem." Now this is clearly speaking of Paul's post-Christian arrival in Jerusalem. It is not talking about the time he went to Jerusalem to be educated and to study. It's not talking about the many times he came to Jerusalem with converts, Christian converts, whom he was prosecuting. And Saul, who a very short while before this had been engaged in the ardent persecution of Christians, searching them out, dragging them to court, to prison, sending them off to die with considerable vigor, earning for himself a reputation both among the religious rulers and the Christians, and you understand the reputation in those two camps was very different. This man now comes to Jerusalem professing conversion, professing change, and looking for all things for fellowship amongst the believers. Surely we understand how nervous they must have been to take this man in. How did they know that this profession was not a ruse, a wily one by which he could gain entrance into the very inner sanctum of the believing community? And they were afraid of him. They wouldn't take him in. And to be sure, that kind of situation is very difficult. It involves taking considerable risk. It can only be met with courage. And you notice who it was who stepped up to the plate. Barnabas. Barnabas, it says, he took Saul and brought him to the disciples. Barnabas is the one who engages Saul in discussion, who meets him, who talks to him, who is persuaded that this man's conversion is not smoke and mirrors, but reality. And I think this says volumes about Barnabas. First, the fact that the disciples accepted Saul because of Barnabas' testimony and endorsement reveals Barnabas to be a man of great credibility, at least among the believers. Only one in whom you had enormous trust would you allow to change your mind about someone like Saul in such a situation. That was Barnabas. And Barnabas, if you look at this, was a man who was open to the idea of God working in highly improbable places and in highly improbable ways. Sometimes our ideas of the work of God are so narrow. We think that God can work only in ways that we allow Him to. That we set the parameters and God must work within those, and if He doesn't, then it's not the work of God. That's manifestly not the understanding of Barnabas. Who, after all, would have had Saul on the list of potential converts? Would you have put him there? Would you have put him there as an interested person in Christianity? And yet, when Saul comes to the Jerusalem church, a brand new convert, fresh from the divine calling of God, looking for a place of belonging, the believers shut him out because they could not imagine that God could have done something like this. But not Barnabas. Barnabas was open to the possibility that God just might be working with the likes of Saul. Barnabas, this also tells us, cared for the newborn, the neophytes, the babes, the newly converted. To me, that is a beautiful thing. Who can imagine Saul's distress at this time? Jerusalem was a place where at one time he had excelled as a student. He had climbed rapidly up the social ladder. He had come to prominence and power. He had become known for his zealous prosecution of the dissidents. And now what can he expect on return but the ridicule and hostility and ire of his former associates? How he must have longed for a place to call home, a place of fellowship. There are occasions yet where new Christians face great disappointment over the refusal of established Christians to make a place for them in the believing community. But in this case, the day was saved, and the day is still saved by Spirit-led people like Barnabas, in whose experience self is not so big as to preclude the welcome of another. And I like very much two observations I read from William Barclay about this. He said this experience demonstrates that Barnabas was a man who insisted on believing the best of others. While some were busy suspecting Saul, Barnabas was looking for reason to believe him. While others were busy passing gossip and innuendo about him, Barnabas, of all things, was talking to him directly in person. What an idea. It made me chuckle when I read these words. The world is largely divided into those who think the best of others and those who think the worst. And it is one of the curious facts of life that ordinarily we see our own reflection in others and make them what we believe them to be. That's a little scary to think about. And then Barnabas was a man who did not hold people's past automatically against them. Saul came to Jerusalem with a long record of active work against Christians, but he came claiming that that was bygone, that it had changed, that he had converted from the old way to the new way. And Barnabas was the first who was willing to look beyond the past to see what the future might hold. And by this action, Barnabas showed himself to be a true Christian, one who had walked far into the province of God. What he demonstrated here is characteristic of God himself, is it not? For God does not hold our past sins against us. God has not held our record against us. How is it then that we so often, when someone makes a mistake, forever label them and brand them with their wrongs? Barnabas, it says, took Saul and brought him to the apostles. And here is a public relations officer at work in the finest sense. So often public relations is an activity done to boost the image of the leader, to boost the image of the institution, or to tell the story of somebody who has already made it and is prominent. Here it is reversed. Barnabas, the established one, the one with credibility, the one with recognition, the one with standing, makes this an occasion to tell not his own story, but the story of a neophyte, that the cause of God might be benefited. Barnabas, we see, took Saul by the hand and stood up to sponsor him, not to those on the periphery of the congregation, but he took him and introduced him in the inner circle of church leadership, and he stuck by this man Saul until he had been accepted. What a picture. Barnabas appears next in the New Testament in those chapters that talk about the church in Antioch, the city where followers of Jesus were first called Christians. I read from Acts 11, verses 22 and 23. News of this new church reached the ears of the church at Jerusalem, and guess who they sent? They sent Barnabas to Antioch. And when he arrived and saw the evidence of the grace of God, he was glad and encouraged them all to remain true to the Lord with all their hearts. From what we know, this new church had come into existence as a result of the preaching of some Jews who had fled the persecutions of Jerusalem. There had been no overt or deliberate church planting, no deliberate missionary endeavor. Those who had escaped Jerusalem had carried the gospel with them, and they had proclaimed it. Some of them had proclaimed it only to the Jews, but some from Cyprus and Cyrene had preached the gospel also to the Gentiles. And their efforts had been blessed by God, and a church with many Gentiles had been born. And as it always is, that news filtered back to headquarters, where it created both curiosity and some consternation, because you remember that in those days there was a serious debate going on as to whether or not the Gentiles could be saved at all. And here now in Antioch, the word comes back. A church has been established in which there are Gentiles who have heard and apparently responded to the gospel, and it looked like God was doing something there, if possible. And so good old Barnabas was told to get on his mule, on his donkey, and travel up to Antioch and see what was happening. In spite of the uncertainty of it all, when Barnabas arrived, the scriptures tell us that he saw evidence of the providence of God at work. A new work was indeed started. The place was indeed overrun with new believers, Gentiles included. And Barnabas, instead of sitting back and saying, well, couldn't be that way, it says that his heart rejoiced. And how many times when something new is started, those who preside over the already existing get their noses out of joint. They become critical and skeptical and predict it will come to naught, and they discourage those who are doing the work. Not so Barnabas. Whenever he saw the hand of God, wherever he saw the hand of God, he was glad. In fact, he was so glad with what he saw here that he set up residence in Antioch. He did not return to Jerusalem. He began to work in Antioch amongst the believers. Barnabas, I think, was a good and godly man. As a result of his labors, the church there prospered. And it is here in Antioch that Barnabas reveals again the uncommon depth of his love for God, the degree to which he allowed God room to work and govern in his life. Because the story unfolds, it tells us that as this new work began to take hold, it became very quickly apparent to Barnabas that the work was bigger than his ability to do it. It became obvious to him that help was needed. And so he did what all observant and humble people do in times like that. He went looking for help. And you and I need to understand that not just anybody would do in that kind of circumstance. Barnabas here had two cultures in one church. He needed somebody with a double background, a Jew brought up in the Jewish tradition, but who could meet Gentiles on equal terms. He needed somebody of courage, for Antioch was no easy place to be a Christian leader. And he needed somebody who was skilled in argument in order to meet both the attacks of the Jews and the Greeks who were opposed. And who in the world could be found for such a task? And Barnabas immediately thought of the new convert, Saul of Tarsus, the neophyte he had sponsored into the believing community, and he went to Tarsus to find him and bring him back, and Saul, now Paul, came back. And together Barnabas and Saul, that's how their names, or Paul, that's how their names appear, worked happily and fruitfully together, the two of them, both of them bicultural. And as they worked, something curious became apparent. This young man, Saul, now Paul, proved to be gifted, very gifted, more gifted, it appears, than his senior. And people in the church and in the community began to recognize it. And this fact shows up in the record in a very subtle way. If you pay close attention, you notice something very interesting. Barnabas and Saul turn into Saul and Barnabas in the record. First, Barnabas is apparently the leader, and then he is eclipsed by the younger man with no apparent animus or upset on the behalf of Barnabas. He who played first fiddle now had to play second fiddle. And as F.F. Bruce once put it, it takes more grace than I can tell to play the second fiddle well. And here I think is food for thought. Barnabas clearly was an able and godly man, a leader in his church, an acknowledged leader. And how often does not leadership foster selfishness, and power easily engenders self-serving? How many leaders there are in the world and in the church today who use their positions to pamper their egos, to gain for themselves whatever they want, to bring to their way privilege? And how many there are who, because of a trust given them, go around making sure they don't lose the perks they have? It is a sad truth, and has been through all of history, that not all leaders have crucified self. Some are stuck on themselves. They are so protective of their positions that they take no risks. They give no chance to anybody else. They spare no effort they invest no effort in the development of others. They reference life to themselves. In such a place, the work of God does not prosper. In Barnabas, self had given up room enough for Christ to come and dwell. Barnabas took a risk, bringing a young and even more capable man into the work where he was. And he cared not about his position or his achievements. Barnabas did not try to surround himself with others who could offer him no challenge, as some do. Barnabas was interested in the prospering of the cause of God. And if that meant that one of his younger men should supersede him, so be it. The junior man, now called Paul, emerges as the leader, and Barnabas allows him the leadership, and the work of God goes on. The church of Antioch prospers. There is one more chapter in the life of Barnabas. On his first missionary journey with Paul, if you remember that, these two missionaries had decided to take a young man named John Mark with them. And by the way, John Mark was related to Barnabas. But John Mark, in the heat of battle, when the opposition became stiff, he gave up courage and he ran for home. And there came the time now for the second journey, recorded in Acts 15, verses 36 to 39. It says that at some time later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the brothers in all the towns where we preach the word of God, and see how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with him, but Paul did not think it wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark. Paul chose Silas. Now, some people are disillusioned by this record of Scripture. How can two preachers have a spat, a sharp disagreement, so much so that they parted company, and we have no further record of Paul and Barnabas working together? And it is interesting that the fuss between them had nothing to do with power or prestige or ego. It had to do with whether or not a new young man named John Mark, who had already quailed once in the face of difficulty, was going to be given a second chance or not. That's what the squabble was over. And I am highly intrigued by this. I think all of us are aware that in most disputes, if you dig down underneath them, you will find in one way or another, ego and pride have been wounded. That's why the fight exists. And if I may characterize Paul a little bit here in an uncharitable way, it seemed this man was more concerned with the task than with those who did the task. He was more concerned over the record of past failure than over the promise of the future. He didn't want anything to do with John Mark. He had fallen down once. And sometimes we are afraid to be committed to young people because they make mistakes, the mistakes of inexperience, which of course when we were young we never made. Mistakes that can jeopardize the work being done, that can make those in charge look bad. But Barnabas saw a young man who needed another chance, and he stood by him even though it produced a ruckus. And here I think is a wonderful nuance to this man Barnabas, that in all his charity and kindness and goodness he was not a wimp. He was tough, he was tenacious, he was willing to stand his ground for what he saw as right. Perhaps Barnabas decided Paul no longer needed a mentor, that he could stand on his own 2 feet, but not so with John Mark. And so he switched. Thankfully, though Paul and Barnabas never worked together, the story does have a happy ending, because we find later in the New Testament that Mark became one of Paul's valued co-workers, became a son in the faith to Peter, and almost certainly he became the writer of the Gospel of Mark. Thank you, Barnabas. These are vignettes, they are bits of a story, of the life story of a man named Barnabas, whose name is familiar, but much of his life is obscure. A Levite from Cyprus, in whose life the grace of God worked with uncommon effect. He learned to surrender personal privilege. He learned to be aware of his limitations. He learned to be generous. He became willing to take risks, to make way for the advancement of others, to hold to commitments regardless of personal cost. He saw joy and sadness, hope and despair, but through it all, he saw the grace of God at work. I like Barnabas. He is the man whose life is an inspiration and a challenge. He gives us cause for hope and courage. While he is not perfect, his living is an inspiration, especially as it relates to selflessness in Christian living. And I take courage and inspiration and instruction from this man. And I believe that if God could work in him to such a degree, if we give him the same kind of chance, would he not do the same for us?